It's a day the people of South Carolina will always remember. A 13-year-old girl named Madeline Carter brutally murdered 20 of her neighbors. But what led to this tragic accident? Keep watching as we dive deeper into this shocking case. Willow Creek, South Carolina was the kind of town that prided itself on its sense of community. It was a place where neighbors exchanged pies over white picket fences, where families gathered for Sunday church services, and where crime was something that happened elsewhere, far removed from the carefully tended lawns and quiet, tree-lined streets. The town had remained largely unchanged for decades, its traditions passed down through generations, its sense of security unshaken by the chaos of the outside world. Parents let their children roam free until the streetlights flickered on, and residents rarely locked their doors at night. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where strangers stood out, and where the biggest concerns were PTA meetings and high school football games. That sense of safety, however, was an illusion, one that would soon be shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. It began with an unsettling quiet, a ripple of unease that spread through the community before anyone could understand why. The first death seemed like a tragedy, but not an anomaly. Ellen Porter, an elderly widow, was found unresponsive in her backyard one warm June morning. She had been tending to her garden as she always did, her sun hat resting in the grass beside her. At first, there was no reason to suspect foul play. She was 83 after all, and her passing was chalked up to the natural course of life. The town mourned her loss with gentle sorrow, speaking of her kindness and generosity, of the way she always had fresh cookies ready for the neighborhood children. Her funeral was well attended, her house left vacant, her presence missed but not questioned. But then, a week later, another death followed. This time, it was Clarence Miller, a retired school teacher who had spent his evenings reading on his porch. He was found slumped in his chair, his reading glasses still perched on his nose, a half-finished novel resting in his lap. There were no signs of struggle, no apparent cause of death beyond what the coroner would later call unexplained cardiac arrest. The town took another breath of sorrow, another collective sigh of resignation. People told themselves that these things happened, that life was fragile, that age caught up with everyone eventually. They sent casseroles to his family and carried on with their lives, unaware that something far more sinister was at play. The deaths continued, creeping through the town like an invisible force, each one striking with an eerie sense of randomness. A young couple, newlyweds who had just moved into their first home, were found dead in their kitchen, their dinner untouched on the table. The coroner's report revealed nothing, no signs of trauma, no poisons, no immediate medical explanations. Their deaths were ruled an unfortunate coincidence, a tragic but unexplainable event. Then came the passing of Lisa Harmon, a single mother who had been seen laughing with friends just the day before. She collapsed in her driveway, her groceries spilling across the pavement, her eyes wide with something like shock. By the time the 6th and 7th deaths occurred, fear had begun to take root. Whispers spread through Willow Creek. Conversations held in hushed tones in supermarket aisles and at coffee shop counters. People speculated, gossiped, tried to make sense of what was happening. Some believed it was an environmental issue, contaminated water, unseen toxins, something explainable yet elusive. Others feared it was something darker, something deliberate. The idea of a serial killer slithered into late-night discussions, but there was no evidence to support such a theory. There were no forced entries, no signs of violence, no connections between the victims, other than the fact that they had lived in the same small town. Law enforcement found themselves at a loss. Investigators combed through reports, searching for patterns, for anything that could explain why seemingly healthy people were dropping dead without warning. Toxicology screens revealed nothing conclusive. There were no poisons detected, no chemicals that might suggest deliberate harm. The bodies bore no marks, no bruises, no signs of struggle. It was as if death had come for them without reason, slipping in unnoticed and vanishing without a trace. The sheriff held press conferences, assuring the public that there was no reason to panic, that the authorities were doing everything in their power to uncover the truth. But behind closed doors, there was only frustration and confusion. And through it all, Madeline Carter watched. She was a quiet girl, small for her age, with dark eyes that seemed too knowing for someone so young. She had lived in Willow Creek her entire life, growing up among the same people who now walked the streets in fear. She was the child who never caused trouble, the one who always completed her homework, who always said please and thank you. To the adults, she was a picture of innocence, a polite and well-mannered girl who spent her free time reading in the shade of her backyard. But the other children knew her differently. They had seen glimpses of something in her that others had not. There was a stillness to her, a quiet calculation in the way she observed the world. She did not laugh at jokes, did not flinch at the things that scared others. She was not cruel, but there was a detachment in her presence, something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up when she turned her gaze toward them. She never raised her voice, never lashed out, never displayed the volatile emotions of a child her age. And, most unsettling of all, she never seemed surprised by anything. As the town unraveled in fear and speculation, Madeline remained unchanged. She went to school, ate dinner with her family, listened to the news with quiet interest. She did not comment on the growing panic, did not engage in the whispered theories that passed between her classmates. If anything, she seemed mildly amused by it all. She knew that the adults were looking in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions. They were desperate for answers, for explanations that made sense, for anything that could restore the order they had always known. But Madeline knew the truth. She had killed them. Every single one, and no one even suspected her. Mrs. Ellen Porter had lived in Willow Creek for over 40 years, a quiet widow with a fondness for her garden and the stray cats that often wandered onto her porch. She was the kind of woman who baked cookies for the neighborhood children, sent handwritten letters instead of emails, and never missed Sunday service at the town's small church. To most, she was a harmless, sweet old woman, but to Madeline Carter, she was an obstacle. It started with the cats. Mrs. Porter, ever the caretaker, made a habit of leaving out bowls of food for the strays that roamed the streets. Over time, the number of cats outside her home grew, lounging on her porch, curling up in her flower beds, and wandering into the yards of nearby neighbors. Madeline hated them. They hissed when she walked too close, clawed at the birds she liked to watch, and disrupted the perfect stillness she craved. One of them, a mangy orange tabby with ragged ears, had scratched her wrist when she tried to push it away from her own yard. The wound was small, barely breaking the skin, but it infuriated her. Mrs. Porter had created the problem, whether she realized it or not, and Madeline had decided that the old woman needed to be removed. She had always been fascinated by poisons. The idea that something so small, so seemingly insignificant, could erase a life without a trace intrigued her. She had spent hours in the library poring over books that detailed the effects of different toxic substances. What could kill instantly, what took longer, what left evidence, what disappeared into the body unnoticed. The knowledge wasn't something she had actively sought at first, but once she discovered it, she couldn't let it go. Poisons were elegant, silent. They left no room for struggle, no mess, no screams. The victims simply ceased to exist, and the world continued on without them. Madeline knew that most deaths in older people were attributed to natural causes, especially those who lived alone. No one would question it. No one would suspect a thing. One afternoon, as she walked past the elderly woman's home, she noticed a freshly baked pie cooling on the windowsill. The scent of cinnamon and sugar drifted through the air, inviting and warm. Mrs. Porter had always been generous, often offering her baked goods to neighbors. Madeline stopped, watching from a distance as the old woman disappeared into her house, leaving the pie unattended. It was almost too easy. She didn't need an invitation. She simply waited until the woman stepped away, then acted quickly. Oleander was a beautiful plant, one that grew in the yards of many homes in Willow Creek. Most people admired its vibrant flowers, never realizing that every part of it was deadly. A handful of crushed leaves, carefully sprinkled into the pie's filling, would be enough. The taste would be masked by the sweetness of the apples, the cinnamon overpowering any bitterness. It was a simple adjustment, one that took less than 30 seconds. She didn't linger, didn't look back. She simply continued walking as if nothing had happened. That evening, the news spread fast. Mrs. Porter had been found unresponsive in her kitchen, slumped over the table, the remnants of her final meal sitting beside her. The coroner determined that she had passed from heart failure, a common enough cause of death for someone her age. There was no suspicion, no reason to question what had happened. The town mourned her, speaking of what a kind soul she had been, how she had lived a full life. Madeline listened, absorbing every word. No one suspected foul play. No one even considered it. Death was a natural part of life, and Mrs. Porter had simply reached the end of hers. The funeral was quiet, attended by the usual circle of churchgoers and longtime neighbors. Madeline watched from a distance, observing the way people grieved, the way they accepted death so easily when it made sense to them. No one looked for a deeper reason. No one asked the right questions. And in that moment, she realized how fragile life truly was. She had done it, and no one suspected a thing. She had expected to feel something different. Guilt, regret, some form of hesitation, but there was nothing. No shame, no remorse. Only a quiet certainty that she had discovered something important, something valuable. The world had always felt too chaotic, too unpredictable. But now she had proof that she could bend it to her will. Her parents never noticed anything unusual. She ate dinner with them that night as they spoke about Mrs. Porter's passing with mild sadness, another inevitable loss in the cycle of life. They never suspected that their daughter had sat only a few feet away from them, knowing she had caused it. The satisfaction was unlike anything she had ever felt before. It wasn't excitement, not in the way most people understood it. There was no rush of adrenaline, no overwhelming sense of triumph. It was calm, a quiet certainty that she had altered the course of reality and no one would ever know. She had taken something permanent, something that could never be undone. And yet the world kept turning as if nothing had changed. She could control life. She could control death. And that power was intoxicating. Not because she enjoyed watching people suffer, but because she had made something happen and the world had simply accepted it. It didn't feel wrong. It felt right. And it wouldn't be the last time. The days following Mrs. Porter's death passed without consequence. The town grieved briefly before life returned to normal, the way it always did in Willow Creek. People mourned, they remembered, and then they moved on. It fascinated Madeline how quickly they let go, how little effort it took for something so significant to fade into the background. She had expected more. More questions, more suspicion, more unease. But instead, it was as if Mrs. Porter had never existed, except in the occasional reminiscence of an old friend or a passing conversation at the local diner. That realization settled into Madeline's mind like a seed, taking root and growing into something undeniable. The power of taking a life wasn't in the act itself, it was in what happened after. The way people accepted death when it fit their understanding of the world. The way they searched for explanations that were easy, convenient, predictable. They didn't look for monsters where they didn't expect them. And no one expected a 13-year-old girl to be anything other than harmless. The thought consumed her. It wasn't like the fleeting curiosities she had entertained before, the ones that faded when something else caught her interest. This was different. It was something real, something that gave her control over the world in a way nothing else ever had. She could alter reality, shift the course of people's lives with the simplest of actions, and no one would ever question it. The adults were too blinded by their own assumptions, and the children were too afraid of her to say anything. She had all the power, and the best part was, no one even realized it. She knew she would do it again. The decision was not impulsive, but methodical, a natural next step rather than an emotional reaction. Her first kill had been an experiment, a test to see if she could do it. Now, she wanted something more. She wanted to see how far she could push it, how much control she truly had. Clarence Miller became her next target. He was a retired schoolteacher known for being stern but fair, the kind of man who believed in structure and discipline. He had taught generations of children, including Madeline's parents when they were young. To the town, he was respected, admired, a fixture in Willow Creek's quiet, predictable way of life. But to Madeline, he was simply the next piece in her game. She had observed him for weeks, noting his habits, his routines. He liked to sit on his porch every evening, a book in one hand, a glass of iced tea in the other. He lived alone, his children grown and moved away, his wife long past. His life was built on order, and in that order, Madeline found her opportunity. She waited until the perfect moment. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she approached his porch with a small, polite smile. He greeted her with mild surprise, but not suspicion. She handed him a cup, a carefully made smoothie she had prepared as an apology for accidentally stepping on his lawn earlier that week. The lie came easily, as natural as breathing. He accepted the drink with a chuckle, unaware of the lethal dose of aconite she had mixed into the sweet, thick blend. He died that night, slumped over in his chair, the book still resting open on his lap. It was too fast for him to call for help, too subtle for anyone to suspect anything other than a natural cause. The coroner's report listed it as a sudden cardiac event, a common fate for someone his age. The town mourned again, just as they had before, and then they moved on. Madeline felt nothing. No guilt, no fear, no regret. Only a deep, quiet satisfaction. It was too easy. She started to wonder just how much she could get away with. How many times she could do this before someone noticed. How far she could push before the world caught on. She wasn't reckless. Recklessness led to mistakes, and mistakes led to suspicion. She chose her victims carefully, those whose deaths would be believable, those whose loss would be seen as unfortunate but inevitable. She had no interest in attention, no need for chaos. She simply wanted to see how much control she could hold without ever being seen. She was patient, watching, waiting, learning. She studied the people around her in a way she never had before, analyzing their weaknesses, their routines, the tiny cracks in their carefully structured lives. She knew more about them than they knew about themselves. Who took medication, who had allergies, who left their doors unlocked, who trusted too easily. She tested new methods, new ways to take a life without leaving a mark, swapping pills, adding just a little too much salt to the diet of someone with high blood pressure, loosening a step on an old porch that would lead to a fatal fall. Each act was calculated, deliberate, perfectly concealed beneath the randomness of life. She experimented, refining her craft. She observed the effects of different poisons, how quickly they worked, how much was needed. She studied accidents, how seemingly innocent things could turn deadly. A missing inhaler at the wrong moment, a misplaced medication bottle, a car parked in just the right spot to force someone to take a more dangerous route home. And with every death, she felt it growing, the thrill of control, not excitement, not joy, but something deeper, something more profound. The knowledge that she held something no one else did, that she could shape the world around her without anyone realizing, that she could bend reality itself to her will. She moved through the world untouched, unnoticed, just as she always had. But now it was by design. She discovered that people were creatures of habit, clinging to patterns that made them feel safe. They explained away tragedies, wrapped them in comfortable logic. An old man's heart giving out? Natural. A woman slipping on the stairs? Tragic, but not impossible. A forgotten allergy? An unnoticed interaction? A missing moment of caution? All things that could be blamed on coincidence. But there was no coincidence. Madeline saw the patterns they couldn't see, the ones she controlled. And with that realization, she understood the most dangerous truth of all. People weren't afraid of what they couldn't see, and as long as she remained invisible, she could do anything she wanted. The fear in Willow Creek did not take hold all at once. It crept in slowly, like a sickness no one could name, a shadow stretching across the town, unnoticed at first, until it was too large to ignore. Death had always been a part of life, especially in a quiet place where generations lived and died in the same houses, walking the same streets their ancestors had before them. It was expected that, from time to time, the town would mourn the passing of someone they had known for years. It was normal, but something was different now. The deaths were coming too quickly, too frequently, and too inexplicably. At first, people tried to rationalize it. Mrs. Porter had been old. Clarence Miller had lived alone. Lisa Harmon had a known heart condition. Each death on its own had an explanation, but as more names were added to the list, those explanations began to feel less convincing. The idea of coincidence became harder to accept when bad luck seemed to be devouring the town whole. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the thought was spreading. Something was wrong in Willow Creek. Neighbors who had once greeted each other warmly now locked their doors at night, their smiles strained, their conversations hesitant. People no longer lingered outside in the evenings, no longer trusted the safety of their quiet routines. Churches filled with hushed prayers for protection. Grocery stores buzzed with whispered speculation. Parents held their children closer, wary of letting them stray too far. The town, once so ordinary, had begun to suffocate under the weight of uncertainty. No one knew who to blame. The police were overwhelmed. They combed through reports, ran tests, conducted interviews, but no answers emerged. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. The victims had simply died, some in their sleep, some in the middle of their day, some in ways so unremarkable that it seemed impossible to suspect anything other than bad luck. But how much bad luck could a town endure before coincidence became something else entirely? The lack of answers made everything worse. The more time passed without an explanation, the more suspicion spread. The residents of Willow Creek began to look at each other differently, searching for answers in the faces of people they had known all their lives. Fear whispered in their ears, feeding their paranoia, convincing them that danger was closer than they thought. People began questioning their neighbors, their co-workers, their friends. The deaths had no pattern, no clear connection, which meant that anyone could be responsible, or worse, that no one was. Fear turned to paranoia, and paranoia turned to desperation. Conversations became clipped. Once friendly smiles became forced, strained. People pulled away from each other, afraid to get too close, afraid to trust. The town's sense of community, once so strong, began to fracture. Longtime friends avoided one another, unwilling to acknowledge the growing unease. Families stayed indoors more often, unwilling to risk whatever unknown force seemed to be at work. It wasn't just that people were dying. It was that no one could explain why, and that was terrifying. The local news stations picked up the story, feeding the growing hysteria with coverage that asked more questions than it answered. Headlines speculated on what could be causing the string of deaths: a curse, an unseen force, a sickness no one could diagnose. Theories began to spread like wildfire. Some believed it was something in the water. Others claimed it was the work of a killer, someone who knew how to strike without leaving a trace. Some turned to superstition, whispering about dark omens, bad energy, something evil lurking beneath the surface of their quiet town. Whatever the cause, one thing was certain. Fear had taken root in Willow Creek, and it was growing fast. People began to see things that weren't there. Shadows in windows, figures in the distance, the feeling of being watched even when they were alone. It became impossible to separate fear from reality. Impossible to know what was real and what was just in their heads. And Madeline Carter watched it all unfold, unnoticed as always. The world around her was unraveling, and yet she remained untouched. No one suspected her. No one looked at her twice. She was still the quiet girl, the polite child, the one no one ever truly saw. She moved through the chaos like a ghost, invisible in plain sight. She knew they were looking for answers. She knew they would never find them. And she knew that, despite their fear, despite the growing tension in their voices, despite the way they searched for danger, they still didn't understand just how much danger they were truly in. Madeline Carter had built her world around control. Every decision was deliberate, every action precise. She never took unnecessary risks, never let emotion dictate her choices. She had spent months perfecting her methods, ensuring that every death was untraceable, that every tragedy fit neatly into the natural course of life. No one suspected her because there had never been a reason to. She was careful, patient, and methodical. But control is a fragile thing, and all it takes is one mistake for everything to fall apart. Her mistake was not in the act itself, but in the choice she made. For the first time, she selected a victim for the wrong reason. All of her previous kills had served a purpose. Mrs. Porter had been a test, an experiment to see if she could do it. Clarence Miller had been a demonstration of how easy it was to manipulate circumstances. Lisa Harmon had been a challenge, a chance to push her methods further. Each death had been calculated, planned with meticulous care. But Jeremy Tully was different. He wasn't chosen because he was convenient. He wasn't chosen because his death would be overlooked. He was chosen because he irritated her, because his presence was disruptive, because he noticed things. Madeline had spent her life being invisible, existing in the background, unnoticed and unchallenged. But Jeremy was different from the others. He had an annoying habit of paying attention. At first, it was nothing. He would watch her the way children sometimes do, curiosity flickering in his gaze before he moved on. But then he started asking questions. He wanted to know why she never seemed surprised by anything, why she was always watching, why she never reacted the way other kids did. It wasn't suspicion, not at first. It was just a child's natural curiosity. But curiosity was dangerous. It made people look closer. It made them start connecting things. She had ignored him at first, hoping he would lose interest. But he didn't. He lingered, hovering at the edges of her world, pushing against the boundaries of her carefully controlled existence. He was too loud, too persistent, too present. He made her feel something she had never felt before: uncertainty. So she decided to remove him. She had always been careful to make her kills seem natural, but Jeremy's death would need to be different. An accident, something tragic but explainable. She had considered drowning him, luring him onto thin ice, orchestrating a fall from a dangerous height. But each method carried too much unpredictability. Accidents were messy. She preferred precision. She decided to be direct. A sharp blow to the head, quick and effective. No mess, no noise, just silence. She had chosen her location carefully. A wooded area behind her house, secluded and quiet. She led him there under the pretense of showing him something interesting, something secret. He followed, just as she knew he would. It was perfect. There would be no witnesses, no interruptions. She had thought of everything, but she had underestimated him. Jeremy had always seemed slow to her, oblivious in the way that most children were. She had assumed he wouldn't notice the shift in her movements, the way she adjusted her stance, the way her fingers tightened around the heavy stone she had concealed behind her back. But something in him must have sensed it, some primal instinct recognizing danger before his mind could process it. At the last second he moved. She swung, but he was already ducking, already running. It was the first time she had failed. For a moment she stood frozen, the weight of her mistake settling in her chest like ice. He was getting away. He was going to tell someone. She considered chasing him, silencing him before he could speak, but she had already lost her advantage. He was faster than she expected, his panic fueling his escape. He would be home in minutes, breathless, terrified, telling the world what she had done. Madeline had never felt fear before, but as she walked back to her house, she felt something close to it. By the time she stepped onto her front porch, she could already hear the commotion in the distance. Jeremy's parents were outside, their voices sharp with panic. Neighbors were gathering, drawn by the urgency, by the shift in the air. The town had been living in fear for weeks, but this was different. This wasn't another unexplained death. This was something tangible. For the first time, they had a name. People had always whispered about the deaths, but there had never been a face to their fears. It had been a shadow, an unseen force lurking beneath the surface. But now, there was a story. A terrified boy running for his life, claiming that Madeline Carter had tried to kill him. She had been so careful. She had built her world on precision, on the belief that she was untouchable. But now, for the first time, people were looking at her. They wouldn't find evidence. There would be no fingerprints, no weapon, nothing that tied her to the other deaths. But suspicion was a powerful thing. Once the idea had been planted, it would grow. Her parents were confused, concerned, questioning her, with voices laced with doubt. The police were involved now, their presence suffocating. They asked her what had happened, why Jeremy had said those things, why he had run home shaking and pale, his words spilling out in frantic gasps. Madeline did not lie. She simply did not explain. She let them make their own conclusions, let them argue over whether Jeremy had misinterpreted something, whether he had fallen and scared himself, whether he was just a boy with an overactive imagination. but doubt had already settled over them all. She could feel it in the way people hesitated before speaking to her, the way their eyes lingered on her a second too long. She had spent her life being invisible, but now she had been seen. The power she had built, the control she had mastered, had started to slip through her fingers. She had thought she was untouchable. Now she wasn't so sure. The moment suspicion touched Madeline Carter, everything began to fall apart. She had spent months controlling the narrative, orchestrating deaths so seamlessly that they blended into the natural order of things. She had been careful, meticulous, invisible. But all of that unraveled the moment Jeremy Tully ran, the moment his fear-laced words reached the ears of those already on edge, desperate for an explanation for the darkness that had settled over Willow Creek. She had always understood that people needed a reason to be afraid. For weeks, the town had been gripped by fear, but it had been a faceless fear, a shapeless entity that hovered just beyond comprehension. People whispered theories, exchanged nervous glances, speculated about unseen forces at play. But now, their fear had a direction. It had a name, and that name was hers. She had made one mistake, but it was enough. The weight of doubt was heavier than any evidence, more damning than proof. In small towns like Willow Creek, the mere suggestion of wrongdoing was enough to shift the tide. At first, the questions were gentle, careful. Her parents were confused but concerned, speaking to her in measured tones, as if trying to convince themselves that there was no way she could be involved. The police were cautious, their questions framed as routine, their words meant to reassure rather than accuse. But beneath that thin layer of civility, she felt it. The change. People were looking at her differently. For the first time, she felt their eyes lingering, their conversations stopping when she entered the room. The town had once seen her as nothing more than a quiet, well-behaved child, someone utterly unremarkable. But now, there was a hesitation in their voices, a stiffness in their movements. They were seeing her now, truly seeing her, and they weren't sure what to do with that realization. She had always known that suspicion spread like wildfire. It did not require logic, only a single spark, and Jeremy had provided that spark. Soon his story twisted and grew, passed from neighbor to neighbor, morphing into something larger than the truth. Some said she had tried to strangle him. Others claimed she had lured him into the woods with a knife. There was no evidence, no real proof, but it didn't matter. Fear didn't need proof. It only needed momentum. The police began to look at her past, revisiting the deaths that had plagued the town for months. 1 or 2 deaths could be dismissed, but 10? That was a pattern. They started with the coroner's reports, sifting through what had once seemed like unrelated tragedies. Mrs. Porter had been ruled a natural passing, but now they looked again. Was it possible something had been missed? Clarence Miller had no history of heart issues. Why had he died so suddenly? Lisa Harmon's medication had been altered, but no one had questioned how. The town had once accepted these losses as inevitable, but now they looked at them through a different lens. As the investigation deepened, they found fragments, small things, overlooked details that on their own meant nothing, but together painted a troubling picture. Madeline had been present near many of the victims in the days leading up to their deaths. She had spent more time observing than speaking, watching people in a way that now seemed unsettling. A librarian recalled her checking out books on poisons, though she had assumed it was innocent curiosity. A store clerk remembered her buying household items that, when combined, could be deadly. A neighbor noted that she never seemed surprised by bad news, never reacted the way a child should. Piece by piece, the illusion she had built was crumbling. Her home, once untouched by scrutiny, became the center of attention. The police obtained a warrant to search her belongings, combing through her bedroom, her school notebooks, her computer. They found a journal buried in the back of her closet, filled with observations. Not confessions, not direct admissions, but detailed notes on people's habits, lists of names and patterns. It wasn't proof, but it was enough. The town had already decided. Her parents, who had once spoken with confidence about their daughter's innocence, began to waver. The community, once so welcoming, had turned cold. Children were pulled away from her. Parents exchanged whispered warnings. Doors that had once been open to her were now closed. And for the first time in her life, Madeline felt the weight of being seen. She had never cared what people thought of her before. She had never needed their approval, their attention, their trust. But now, it wasn't about approval. It was about the inevitability of what was coming. She had been too careful for them to have undeniable proof. But she had underestimated the power of certainty. There was no trial, no moment of confession. There didn't need to be. The town no longer needed evidence. They had already decided what they believed. The police took her into custody, not because they had irrefutable proof, but because the alternative was to do nothing, and the town would not accept that. The newspapers called her the Willow Creek Killer. Psychologists debated whether she was a sociopath or something worse. People speculated about what had created her. Was it neglect? Was it something broken inside her? Was she simply born without humanity? The truth didn't matter anymore. She had spent her life mastering the art of being invisible. Now she would never be invisible again.